Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls growing up in small-town Texas. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or watching movies, she was in her father's garage learning martial arts from old military training videos. Her father, a retired Marine, had taught her that strength came not from size but from discipline, technique, and mental toughness. At 25, Sarah stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a lean but muscular build that spoke of countless hours in the gym. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held a quiet intensity that made people take notice. She worked as a physical trainer at Elite Fitness, a high-end gym in San Diego that attracted military personnel, athletes, and celebrities. The gym was more than just a workplace for Sarah. It was her sanctuary, her proving ground, and the place where she had built a reputation as one of the most skilled trainers on the West Coast. Members came from all over California to train with her, drawn by stories of her unconventional methods and impressive results. Sarah had earned her reputation through years of dedicated study. She held black belts in 3 different martial arts, was certified in advanced self-defense techniques, and had spent 2 summers training with former Special Forces instructors in Colorado. What made her truly special, however, was her ability to read people and understand exactly how to push them to achieve more than they thought possible. The gym itself was impressive. Spread across 15,000 square feet, it featured state-of-the-art equipment, multiple training areas, and a large open space called the demonstration floor where trainers could work with clients or hold group sessions. The demonstration floor was surrounded by a viewing area with benches, making it perfect for seminars or large group training sessions. On this particular Thursday evening, the gym was hosting its monthly Tactical Fitness Showcase, an event that drew military personnel, law enforcement officers, and martial arts enthusiasts from across Southern California. The event featured demonstrations of various combat techniques, fitness challenges, and opportunities for attendees to test their skills against trained instructors. Sarah had been looking forward to this event for weeks. She was scheduled to demonstrate defensive techniques against larger opponents, a subject she was passionate about teaching. Too many people, especially women, believed they were helpless against bigger, stronger attackers. Sarah knew better, and she loved proving that knowledge, skill, and proper technique could overcome raw physical power. As the evening began, nearly 500 people packed into the gym. Military personnel in uniform mingled with civilians in workout gear. The energy was electric, with conversations buzzing about the various demonstrations planned for the evening. Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting familiar faces and introducing herself to newcomers. Among the crowd were members from nearby military bases, including Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, home to the famous Navy SEALs. It was common for SEALs to attend these events, both to stay sharp with their training and to network with other professionals in the tactical community. Sergeant Mike Davidson was one such SEAL. At 6 feet 2 inches and weighing 220 pounds, he commanded attention wherever he went. His broad shoulders, thick chest, and confident swagger spoke of years in Special Forces. Mike had been a SEAL for 8 years and had completed multiple deployments overseas. He was known among his teammates for his physical prowess and his unwavering belief in traditional military hierarchy. Mike arrived at the gym with 3 other SEALs, all wearing their dress uniforms despite the casual nature of the event. He wanted people to know exactly who they were dealing with. In his mind, there was a natural order to things, and Special Forces operators sat at the top of that hierarchy, especially when it came to matters of combat and physical confrontation. As Mike surveyed the gym, his eyes fell on Sarah, who was setting up equipment for her demonstration. He watched her for a moment, noting her small frame and thinking about the announcement he had heard regarding her upcoming demonstration about defeating larger opponents. The idea struck him as amusing, almost insulting. "You see that little trainer over there?" Mike said to his companions, nodding toward Sarah. "She's supposed to show people how to take down bigger opponents. Might be interesting to see what she thinks she knows about real combat." His teammates exchanged glances. They knew Mike's personality well. He was an excellent soldier and a loyal friend, but he had strong opinions about civilian martial arts and what he saw as unrealistic self-defense training. Mike believed that real combat was about size, strength, and military training. Not the choreographed movements he associated with civilian martial arts schools. Sarah finished her setup and checked the schedule. Her demonstration was set to begin in 30 minutes. She had planned to work with Tom, one of the other trainers, who would act as the aggressive larger opponent while she demonstrated various defensive techniques. However, Tom had called in sick that afternoon, leaving Sarah to find a volunteer from the audience. She approached the microphone in the center of the demonstration floor. The crowd gradually quieted as she began to speak. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Martinez, and I'm excited to share some defensive techniques with you tonight. We're going to focus on situations where you might face a larger, stronger opponent, and show you that size isn't everything in a confrontation. Sarah paused, scanning the crowd. I was planning to work with one of our trainers tonight, but he's under the weather. So I'm looking for a volunteer from the audience, someone significantly larger than me, who's willing to help demonstrate these techniques. Several hands went up around the room. Sarah's eyes moved across the volunteers, looking for someone who would provide a good demonstration, while also being safe to work with. She needed someone large enough to make the techniques impressive, but experienced enough to know how to fall safely and not panic when the moves were applied. Mike Davidson's hand shot up immediately. His voice carried across the room as he called out, "I'll do it." Sarah looked in his direction, taking in his size and obvious military bearing. He was certainly large enough for a good demonstration, and his military background suggested he would know how to handle himself safely. What she couldn't see was the condescending smile on his face, or hear the whispered comments he was making to his teammates about showing this civilian what real training looks like. "Great," Sarah replied. "Come on up and introduce yourself to everyone." "Great." Mike strode confidently onto the demonstration floor, his combat boots echoing in the suddenly quiet gym. The crowd recognized his uniform and bearing immediately, and a murmur of excitement rippled through the assembled group. This was going to be more than just a routine demonstration. "I'm Sergeant Mike Davidson, United States Navy SEALs," he announced, his voice projecting easily across the room. The crowd erupted in appreciative applause. Recognizing the elite status of the Special Forces unit, Sarah extended her hand for a handshake, which Mike accepted with a grip that was noticeably stronger than necessary. "Thanks for volunteering, Sergeant. This will be a great demonstration." Mike nodded, but his expression remained serious. "I have to say, ma'am, I'm curious to see what you think you can show these people about handling a real threat. In my experience, when it comes to actual combat, size and training matter more than anything else." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the shift in the room's energy immediately. What had started as a friendly training demonstration was beginning to feel like something else entirely. The crowd sensed it too, pressing closer to get a better view of what was developing. Sarah maintained her professional composure, but her mind was already adjusting to the situation. She had dealt with skeptics before, including plenty of military personnel who questioned civilian training methods. The key was to remain respectful while demonstrating that their assumptions might not be as solid as they believed. "That's an interesting perspective, Sergeant. Size and training are certainly important factors. What we're going to explore tonight is how technique and leverage can level the playing field when someone doesn't have the advantage of size or traditional combat training." Mike crossed his arms over his chest, his stance widening slightly. "With all due respect, ma'am, I've been in real combat situations. I've seen what works and what doesn't when lives are on the line. There's a big difference between gym techniques and what happens when someone is actually trying to hurt you." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing the underlying tension. Sarah realized that this demonstration had become about more than just teaching defensive techniques. Sergeant Davidson was challenging not just her methods but her credibility in front of 500 people. This was no longer a friendly volunteer situation. It had become a test of everything she had trained for. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Instead of backing down or trying to diffuse the situation with diplomatic words, she decided to meet the challenge head-on. "You're absolutely right about real combat being different from training, Sergeant. So let's make this demonstration as realistic as possible. Instead of choreographed moves, Why don't you actually try to overpower me? Use your size, your strength, and your training. Don't hold back because I'm smaller, or because we're in a gym. Show everyone what real Special Forces training can do." The gym fell completely silent. Mike's eyebrows raised in surprise. This wasn't what he had expected. He had assumed the trainer would demonstrate some basic moves with his cooperation, proving his point about civilian training being unrealistic. Now she was essentially challenging him to a real confrontation. Mike's teammates shifted uncomfortably in the crowd. They knew their friend well enough to recognize the look that was crossing his face. Mike Davidson didn't back down from challenges, especially not in front of an audience of his peers. But they also recognized that this situation was escalating beyond what anyone had planned. "Are you sure about that, ma'am?" Mike asked, his voice carrying a new edge. "I mean, I don't want anyone getting hurt here." Sarah nodded calmly. "I'm absolutely sure. The whole point of defensive training is that it works against someone who's actually trying to win. If these techniques only work when someone is cooperating, then they're not really defensive techniques at all, are they?" Mike looked around the room, seeing hundreds of faces, watching his every move. Military personnel, law enforcement officers, martial arts practitioners, and civilians all waited to see how he would respond. His reputation and credibility felt like they were on the line. "All right then," Mike said, rolling his shoulders and stepping closer to Sarah. "But I want everyone to understand that this isn't a game anymore. When someone my size comes at someone her size with serious intent, the outcome is usually pretty predictable." Sarah remained perfectly still, her body language relaxed but alert. Years of training had taught her to control her breathing and heart rate, even in stressful situations. She could feel the anticipation radiating from the crowd, but her focus was entirely on the man in front of her. Mike began to circle her slowly, his military training evident in his movement and positioning. He was treating this like a real confrontation now, analyzing her stance and looking for weaknesses he could exploit. His confidence was absolute. In his mind, this demonstration would prove once and for all that real combat came down to physical superiority and military training. "Whenever you're ready, Sergeant," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady and clear. Mike nodded and suddenly lunged forward, moving faster than many in the crowd expected from someone his size. His goal was simple: close the distance quickly and use his superior size and strength to control the smaller opponent. It was a straightforward approach that had served him well in his military career. Sarah watched his approach with the calm focus of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment for years. As Mike reached for her, she moved with fluid precision, her body shifting in ways that made his grasping hands find only empty air. Before he could adjust his momentum, Sarah had stepped behind him and applied a technique that used his own forward motion against him. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 seconds. Mike Davidson, all 220 pounds of Special Forces training and physical power, found himself flat on his back on the demonstration mat, with Sarah standing calmly beside him. The gym erupted in shocked silence, then exploded into amazed cheers and applause. Mike lay on the mat for a moment, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had just happened. He had been completely confident in his approach, and yet somehow, this small civilian trainer had not only avoided his attack, but had actually put him on the ground using what felt like nothing more than his own momentum. Sarah extended a hand to help him up, her expression showing no triumph or mockery, only professional respect. "Size and strength are definitely important factors, Sergeant, but leverage, timing, and technique can sometimes be even more important." Mike accepted her hand and pulled himself to his feet, his mind racing as he tried to understand exactly what had happened. The rational part of his brain recognized that he had just learned something valuable, but his pride and his entire worldview were struggling to accept what had occurred. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, everyone talking at once about what they had just witnessed. Military personnel who had been certain of the outcome were reassessing their assumptions about civilian training. Civilians who had felt intimidated by the sergeant's confident predictions were suddenly seeing new possibilities for their own safety and empowerment. But Mike Davidson wasn't ready to accept this result. In his mind, what had just happened was either a fluke or the result of his own overconfidence. He couldn't let it end here. Not in front of all these people. Not with his reputation and his beliefs about combat hanging in the balance. Mike brushed himself off and looked around the room, seeing the amazed faces of his fellow military personnel and the excited chatter of civilians who had just witnessed something they hadn't expected. His jaw tightened as he processed not just the physical takedown, but the blow to his professional reputation and personal beliefs about combat superiority. That was impressive, Mike said, his voice carrying a forced calm that didn't quite hide his frustration. But in real combat, people don't stop after one exchange. They keep coming until the fight is over. Sarah nodded respectfully, recognizing both the challenge in his words and the wounded pride behind them. She had seen this reaction before from military and law enforcement personnel who had built their entire identity around being the toughest person in the room. Having that identity challenged, especially publicly, was more than just embarrassing. It was fundamentally threatening to their sense of self. You're absolutely right about that, Sergeant. Real confrontations rarely end with a single technique. Would you like to continue the demonstration? The crowd pressed closer, sensing that this was developing into something far more significant than the scheduled training session. Camera phones appeared throughout the audience as people realized they might be witnessing something extraordinary. Military personnel from various branches watched with intense interest, while civilian attendees found themselves caught between excitement and concern. Mike's teammates exchanged worried glances. They could read their friend's body language and knew he was approaching the point where pride would override good judgment. Sergeant Rodriguez, Mike's closest friend in the unit, stepped forward slightly, as if preparing to intervene, but Mike's sharp look warned him to stay back. "Let's continue," Mike said, his voice now carrying an edge of determination that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. "But this time, I want to show everyone what happens when someone doesn't give up after the first technique fails." Sarah recognized the change in his demeanor immediately. What had started as a demonstration was becoming a real confrontation, with real emotions and real stakes involved. She could diffuse the situation by backing down or suggesting they return to scripted demonstrations, but she also knew that doing so would undermine everything she had spent years trying to teach people about the effectiveness of proper defensive training. "All right, Sergeant, but I want everyone to understand that we're moving beyond basic demonstration now. Real defensive situations require real responses, and that means this might get uncomfortable for both of us." Mike removed his dress uniform jacket and handed it to one of his teammates, revealing a tight-fitting undershirt that showed his muscular build even more clearly. The crowd could see the definition in his arms and shoulders, the result of years of intensive physical training designed to create the ultimate warrior. "Uncomfortable is what real combat is all about," Mike replied, beginning to move in a slow circle around Sarah again. "Technique is fine when you're in a controlled environment with rules and cooperation, but when someone is really trying to hurt you, when there's real violence involved, that's when size and strength become the deciding factors." Sarah remained centered and calm, her breathing steady and her posture relaxed but ready. Years of training had taught her that emotional control was just as important as physical technique. Anger, fear, or pride could all lead to mistakes that would give a larger opponent the advantage they needed to win. "Size and strength are definitely advantages," she agreed, watching Mike's movement patterns and analyzing his approach. "But advantages aren't guarantees. The question is whether someone can use their advantages effectively while dealing with techniques designed to neutralize those advantages." Mike suddenly changed his approach, feinting left and then rushing in from the right, his hands reaching not for a simple grab but for a bear hug that would lift Sarah off the ground and eliminate her mobility. It was a smart tactical decision that played to his strengths while attempting to limit her options for response. Sarah read his movement almost before it began, her trained eye catching the subtle weight shifts that preceded his change of direction. As his arms wrapped around her, she didn't try to break free through strength but instead used a combination of leverage and anatomical knowledge to create space, and then apply pressure to specific points that made maintaining his grip impossible. Mike found himself on the mat again, this time with Sarah controlling his arm in a position that would become extremely painful if he tried to resist. The technique had been applied so smoothly that many in the crowd hadn't even seen how she had transitioned from being grabbed to controlling him. The key to dealing with strength advantages is not to fight against them directly. Sarah explained to the audience, while maintaining her position. Instead, you redirect that strength and use it to create opportunities for more effective techniques. Mike could feel the pressure building in his shoulder and knew that struggling would only make it worse. But releasing him required Sarah to give up her controlling position. And Mike was ready this time. The moment she let go and stepped back, he rolled away and came up in a crouch, his military training evident in his quick recovery. "That's good technique," he admitted, genuine respect creeping into his voice despite his frustration. "But you're assuming that your opponent will react the way you expect. What happens when someone doesn't play by the rules you've learned?" Without waiting for an answer, Mike launched into an attack that combined multiple approaches. Instead of trying to grab or strike in predictable patterns, he used his size to simply pressure forward, using his body weight and reach to try to overwhelm Sarah's ability to maintain distance and position. It was an effective strategy that showed his tactical thinking. By abandoning specific techniques in favor of constant pressure, Mike was forcing Sarah to deal with a style of attack that couldn't be answered with single defensive moves. This was the kind of aggressive, overwhelming approach that had made military combatives effective in close-quarters combat situations. Sarah found herself giving ground for the first time, her footwork keeping her safe but not providing the clear opportunities for decisive techniques that she had enjoyed in the previous exchanges. Mike's constant forward pressure was exactly the kind of problem that smaller defenders struggled with against determined larger attackers. The crowd watched in fascination as the two combatants moved across the mat, Mike pressing his attack while Sarah worked to manage distance and look for openings. It was clear that this had moved far beyond demonstration into something approaching real combat, and the intensity in the room was palpable. Mike managed to corner Sarah against the edge of the demonstration area, his larger frame blocking most of her escape routes. For a moment, it seemed like his strategy was working, that he had finally proved his point about the limitations of technique against size and aggression. But Sarah had been in similar positions many times during her training. Being cornered didn't panic her. Instead, it clarified her options and eliminated the hesitation that came from having too many choices. With limited space to work with, she committed fully to a technique that used Mike's forward momentum and her position against the wall to generate maximum leverage. The result was spectacular. Mike found himself airborne, his feet leaving the ground as Sarah's technique redirected all of his forward energy upward and backward. He landed hard on the mat, the impact driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping as he tried to regain his bearings. The crowd erupted in amazed cheers and applause, but Sarah wasn't celebrating. She could see that Mike was winded, but not seriously hurt, and she recognized the look in his eyes. This wasn't over for him. His pride, his beliefs about combat, and his reputation were all tied up in this confrontation now, and he wouldn't stop until he felt he had proved his point or been completely defeated. "Are you all right, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, offering him a hand up once again. Mike accepted her help but didn't release her hand immediately after getting to his feet. Instead, he used his grip to pull her closer, his size advantage allowing him to control the distance between them in a way that limited her movement options. "I'm fine," he said, his breathing still heavy from the impact. "But I think you're starting to understand what I mean about real combat. That technique worked because I wasn't expecting it. In a real fight, someone doesn't give you time to set up perfect throws." Sarah could feel the strength in his grip and recognized that he was testing whether she could escape from close contact when he was prepared for her techniques. It was a legitimate tactical question, and one that went to the heart of the debate between technique and physical dominance. "You're right that real combat is different from demonstration," Sarah replied calmly. "But the difference isn't always what people think it is. Sometimes real combat is messier and more chaotic, but sometimes it's also more straightforward because people's options become limited by stress and adrenaline." While she spoke, Sarah was analyzing her position and Mike's grip, looking for the most effective way to address his challenge. She could feel the tension in his muscles and recognized that he was committed to maintaining control this time, determined not to be surprised by another technique he hadn't expected. Mike pulled her closer, testing whether her techniques would work from what felt like an impossible position. In his mind, this was the real test. Could civilian martial arts work when someone bigger and stronger was actively trying to prevent them from being applied? Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. Instead of trying to break away from his grip, she moved closer, using the principles of leverage and anatomy that she had spent years studying. Her technique didn't require space or distance. It used Mike's own strength against him by targeting the mechanical weak points in his grip and posture. Mike found himself on the ground again, this time with Sarah controlling both his arm and his position in a way that made any resistance extremely uncomfortable. The technique had been so quick and smooth that many in the audience hadn't even seen how she had transitioned from being controlled to controlling him. The misconception is that technique only works when you have space and time to set it up, Sarah explained to the crowd while maintaining her position. Actually, many of the most effective techniques work best when someone is committed to a specific action, because that commitment creates predictable vulnerabilities. Mike lay on the mat, feeling the controlled pressure Sarah was applying, and recognizing that any attempt to muscle his way out would only result in pain. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, he was forced to really consider what was happening and what it meant for his understanding of combat. But his pride wouldn't let him concede. Not yet. When Sarah released the hold and stepped back, Mike didn't immediately get up. Instead, he lay on the mat for a moment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything he believed about strength, size, and fighting effectiveness. The crowd waited in respectful silence, sensing that something significant was happening beyond just a training demonstration. Military personnel throughout the audience were having their own moments of reflection, reconsidering assumptions they had held for years about the relationship between physical power and combat effectiveness. When Mike finally stood up, his expression was different. The cocky confidence was gone, replaced by something more complex. He was angry, confused, and impressed all at the same time. Everything he had believed about his own capabilities and the nature of combat had been challenged in the space of 15 minutes. "I need to understand what's happening here," Mike said, his voice carrying a new note of genuine curiosity alongside the frustration. "Everything I've been taught, everything I've experienced in real combat situations, says this shouldn't be possible, but you've put me down 3 times now, and I can't figure out how." Sarah nodded respectfully, recognizing both his confusion and his willingness to question his own assumptions. "Would you like me to explain what's happening from a technical perspective? Sometimes understanding the mechanics makes it easier to accept the results." Mike looked around the room at the hundreds of faces watching them, then back at Sarah. His next decision would determine not just how this confrontation ended, but how he would process this experience and what it would mean for his future understanding of combat and personal capability. "Yes," he said finally. "But I want to understand by doing, not just by talking. Show me again, but slower this time so I can see what's really happening." The crowd leaned forward with renewed interest. This was no longer about proving who was stronger or whose training was more effective. It had become about learning, understanding, and the possibility that everything they thought they knew about combat might need to be reconsidered. Sarah appreciated Mike's willingness to learn, recognizing that it took considerable courage for someone in his position to admit confusion publicly. Many people, especially those with strong military backgrounds, would have simply walked away rather than acknowledge that their understanding might be incomplete. The key to understanding these techniques is recognizing that they work with human biomechanics rather than against them. Sarah began, positioning herself where the entire crowd could see. When someone attacks, they're committing their balance, their weight distribution, and their momentum to a specific direction and intention. That commitment creates opportunities. Mike nodded, his analytical mind engaging with the problem in a new way. "Show me that first takedown again, the one where you got behind me. I want to see exactly where I lost control of the situation." Sarah gestured for him to approach as he had before, but this time she moved in slow motion, breaking down each element of the technique as she applied it. "When you lunged forward, you committed your weight to moving in that direction. Instead of trying to stop your momentum, I redirected it by stepping offline and using this hand position to guide your movement." As she demonstrated, Mike could see how his own forward energy had been used against him. The technique wasn't about Sarah overpowering him. It was about her understanding where his balance was going and helping it continue in a direction that worked to her advantage. "I see what happened," Mike said, genuine amazement in his voice. "I was so focused on reaching you that I didn't consider how my own momentum could be redirected. In military training, we focus a lot on power and aggression, but we don't really address this kind of tactical thinking." The crowd was riveted by this analysis, many of them beginning to understand not just what had happened, but why traditional assumptions about size and strength might be incomplete. Military personnel throughout the audience were taking mental notes, recognizing that there might be gaps in their own training that needed to be addressed. "Let's try the second technique," Sarah suggested. "The one where you grabbed me in a bear hug. That's a common attack because it seems to eliminate the defender's options for movement." Mike approached again, this time wrapping his arms around Sarah from the front in a powerful embrace that lifted her feet slightly off the ground. To the observers, it looked like a position from which escape would be impossible for someone her size. Sarah moved slowly through her escape, explaining each step. "The mistake people make is thinking they need to break free through strength. Instead, I'm creating space by targeting specific anatomical weak points, where even small amounts of pressure can be very effective." As she demonstrated, Mike could feel exactly what was happening. Her technique didn't require her to be stronger than him. It required her to understand human anatomy better than he did. The pressure she applied to specific points made maintaining his grip uncomfortable enough that releasing her became the natural response. "That's incredible," Mike admitted as he let her go. "I could feel exactly what you were doing, and I understand why it worked. But I still don't think I could defend against it effectively. The knowledge and timing required to apply these techniques under pressure must take years to develop." Sarah smiled, pleased that he was beginning to understand the complexity behind what looked like simple movements. "You're absolutely right about the training time. These techniques aren't magic, and they're not easy. They require the same kind of dedication and practice that military skills require. The difference is what you're training to accomplish." Mike looked thoughtful, his analytical mind working through the implications of what he had learned. "In the military, we train for overwhelming force and tactical superiority. We want to win through being better armed, better positioned, and more aggressive than the enemy. But what you're showing is a completely different approach to the same problem." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "Military tactics are designed for military situations, where you have equipment, backup, and specific objectives. Civilian defensive tactics are designed for situations where you might be alone, unarmed, and facing someone who has chosen the time and place of the confrontation." The crowd was completely absorbed in this conversation, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare, a genuine meeting of minds between two different approaches to the same fundamental challenge. The hostility and competition that had characterized the beginning of the encounter had transformed into mutual respect and shared learning. Mike's teammates had relaxed considerably as they watched their friend's attitude shift from defensive aggression to genuine curiosity. They could see that this experience was changing how he thought about combat. But they could also see that it wasn't diminishing his confidence or his capabilities. It was expanding them. "I want to try something," Mike said, his voice carrying a new note of determination. "I want to see if I can apply what I'm learning. Can you attack me? And I'll try to use these principles instead of just relying on size and strength." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the request. "Are you sure? It's one thing to understand these concepts intellectually, but applying them under pressure when someone is actually attacking requires a different kind of preparation." Mike nodded firmly. "I need to understand this from both sides. If these techniques are really as effective as you've demonstrated, then I need to know how to use them myself. Size and strength won't always be advantages, and there might be situations where this kind of knowledge could be life-saving." Sarah appreciated his reasoning and recognized the practical wisdom behind his request. "All right. But we'll start slowly and build up intensity gradually. The most important thing is understanding the principles before worrying about speed or power." She approached Mike with a basic attack, moving slowly enough that he could analyze what was happening and formulate his response. Mike attempted to apply the redirection principles he had observed, with mixed but encouraging results. "Focus on feeling where my balance is going instead of trying to stop my movement," Sarah coached as they worked through the technique. Your military training makes you want to meet force with greater force. But these techniques work by meeting force with redirection. In work, Mike tried again, this time with better success. When Sarah's attack came in, he managed to step offline and use her momentum against her, though his execution was rough compared to her polished technique. "I can feel it working," he said with excitement. "But it's completely different from anything I've ever trained. It's like learning a new language, where all the rules are different from what you already know." The crowd watched with fascination as the roles reversed, with Sarah now providing instruction while Mike attempted to apply unfamiliar concepts. Many of the military personnel in the audience were taking mental notes, recognizing that they were witnessing the integration of two different but potentially complementary approaches to combat training. "The hardest part for people with military or sports backgrounds," Sarah explained to the audience while Mike practiced, "is letting go of the instinct to use force against force. Those instincts are valuable in many situations, but they can also create blind spots where technique could be more effective than power." Mike attempted the technique several more times, gradually improving as he began to internalize the new concepts. His military discipline and training capacity served him well in adapting to unfamiliar methods, even though the principles were fundamentally different from what he had learned. "This is humbling," Mike admitted during a brief break. "Not just because I got taken down, but because I'm realizing how much I don't know about combat. I've been so confident in my training that I never considered there might be completely different approaches that could be equally valid." Sarah nodded understandingly. "That's a common reaction, especially from people with strong backgrounds in traditional martial arts or military training. Everyone develops blind spots based on their experience, and it can be shocking to discover that those blind spots exist." Mike looked around at the crowd of military and civilian personnel who had been watching their entire exchange. His expression showed a mixture of embarrassment and excitement as he processed what this experience meant for his understanding of his own capabilities. "I owe everyone here an apology," Mike said, his voice carrying across the quiet gym. "I came into this demonstration with assumptions about civilian training and about my own superiority that were obviously wrong. Sarah has shown me that real expertise comes from knowledge and skill, not just from size, strength, or even military training." The crowd erupted in applause, appreciating both his honesty and the learning process they had all witnessed. Military personnel throughout the audience were nodding with understanding, recognizing the courage it took to publicly acknowledge that one's assumptions had been incorrect. Sarah smiled warmly at Mike's acknowledgement. "What you've shown tonight is just as impressive as any technique, Sergeant. It takes real strength to question your own beliefs, and real wisdom to learn from unexpected sources. That's the kind of mental flexibility that makes someone truly formidable." Mike extended his hand for a handshake, which Sarah accepted with obvious respect. "Thank you for the lesson," he said. "All of them. I hope we can continue this learning process in the future." Quote, as they shook hands, the crowd rose in sustained applause, recognizing that they had witnessed something special. Not just impressive physical techniques, but the kind of personal growth and intellectual honesty that comes from being willing to challenge one's own assumptions. The formal demonstration concluded, but many attendees remained in the gym for hours afterward, discussing what they had witnessed and asking questions about both military combatives and civilian defensive techniques. Mike and Sarah spent much of that time answering questions together, their earlier confrontation having evolved into a collaborative exploration of different approaches to combat training. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened at Elite Fitness spread throughout the military and martial arts communities. Video footage taken by attendees circulated widely, generating discussions about the relationship between physical capability and technical knowledge in combat situations. Mike returned to his SEAL team with a new perspective on training and capability. He began incorporating some of the principles Sarah had shown him into his own preparation, and he encouraged his teammates to consider civilian martial arts training as a complement to their military instruction. Sarah found herself invited to conduct training sessions at military facilities, where her techniques were evaluated for their potential application in special forces situations. The integration of civilian defensive techniques with military combatives became a subject of serious study and discussion. The encounter that had begun as a simple demonstration had become a catalyst for broader conversations about the nature of combat training, the value of different approaches to physical confrontation, and the importance of remaining open to learning from unexpected sources. Both Mike and Sarah later reflected that the evening had changed their lives in ways they never could have anticipated. What had started as a challenge to prove superiority had become a lesson in humility, learning, and the recognition that true strength often comes from understanding rather than force. The 500 witnesses who packed Elite Fitness that night had come expecting to see routine demonstrations of fitness techniques. Instead, they had witnessed something much more valuable: the process of personal growth that comes from being willing to question assumptions and learn from those who think differently about fundamental challenges. Years later, the story would still be told in military circles and martial arts schools as an example of how real learning happens when pride gives way to curiosity, and how the most important victories are often won not against opponents, but against the limitations of one's own understanding.